Hello, Blazers. Welcome to episode 136 of UAB Green and Told, original release Monday, November 4th, 2024. Through our podcast, we are given the opportunity to share stories from members of the UAB community. Listen in to previous episodes of Green and Told, the most listened to podcast on campus, at alumni.uab.edu/Green and Told, on Spotify, and the Apple Podcast app. While there, I'd like to encourage you to leave a written review to help more alums find us. I'm Greg Berry, a UAB alum and Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Imagine being forced into hiding in a foreign country with few places to turn. It's a scenario Kathleen Stafford is familiar with. You see, just months after moving to Iran, this real-life worst-case scenario became a reality for the wife of an American diplomat.
We had a few shorter assignments than that, cut short by civil unrest and things like that, but it felt like a natural enough rhythm of life.
And as Kathleen will share, after the U.S. Embassy was overrun, her group tried to make a break for it, but they were forced to change their plans.
And we started walking toward the British Embassy, which was supposed to be our safe haven. But then we saw there was a whole nother mob coming from that direction.
And just like the script written for a movie, danger lurked everywhere.
You've got to get your people out. My people are in danger too. That's when they turned to the CIA. And the CIA was able to put this plan together within 1 month to get us out.
Growing up, it wasn't uncommon for Kathleen Stafford's family to pack up and move to the next city from time to time. The daughter of an Air Force navigator, she lived all over the United States. Those experiences followed her into adulthood, bouncing around married to an American diplomat. But before she talks about her role during the Iran hostage crisis, we need to know more about her and her connection to UAB, one that starts with an interest in art.
Yes, my grandfather was a painter. And so my mother always encouraged me. And in the third grade, my teacher said if I finished my work early, I could do the bulletin board. So it was probably to keep me out of trouble. But that set me off. I was ready to play with things and colors and shapes and design. So I was always interested in, passionate about art.
You were at UAB in the early 70s when your husband had the job at Social Security. What was the city like at that time compared to other cities that you had lived in?
We had just looked at university catalogs and decided to move to Birmingham with the Social Security possibility. So, we were completely naive about everything. And so I was just really lucky that there was even a program at UAB. And also they let me, attend as a in-state student. It was small. And, there were buildings around various parts of the university. I think the humanities building with the art department might have just been built. And I'm sure that from what I see in the catalog and over the years, I've watched how the art department has grown. It's just amazing now.
As an art student, what did you want to do after you obtained your degree?
Well, I thought I would just go and get a master's in studio art. I always had thought that that my husband would become a professor, because that's what he was going to. After we finished in Birmingham, he went back to the University of Tennessee to finish his master's, and then he was going to get a PhD. And so I was going to go teach art someplace. I had just planned to be an art teacher, a university professor.
As a daughter of somebody that was in the Air Force, you did move around a lot. And it kind of followed you as you got older. Once you got married, you stayed in Birmingham a little while, you moved up to Knoxville, but then you expand your reach kind of globally. What happened that led you and your husband to live a life around the world?
My husband Joe was working on his master's, and then we went to Rome, and he worked for an import-export company for about a year or so. And he'd also always thought he was just going to do it temporarily and then go back to university. So we went back to the University of Florida. At that point, he decided he'd made a mistake, and he wanted to do international travel, and he really didn't want to just be, working at a university, as it turned out. So then he applied for the State Department. He wanted to finish his PhD. And the State Department said, no, you have to be here in 10 days or your offer is rescinded.
Wow.
And so I had to give my notice, and we packed up and we went to Washington. But living in, working in the Foreign Service, it felt normal. 3 years and you pack up. But we had a few shorter assignments than that, cut short by civil unrest and things like that. But it felt like a natural enough rhythm of life.
There were 3 times in both of your lives where you really experienced that unrest. We're going to start with Tehran because that was the first one and probably the most famous one that most Americans really know about. That was in the late 70s. How long were you in Tehran before you had to go into hiding?
We were just there for 2 months.
Wow.
We had arrived in September, and we were in temporary housing on the compound. The embassy had drawn down quite a bit, and the 25,000 or so Americans who had been working in Iran with the military and all sorts of other connections had already left because of the embassy was attacked the February before we arrived. It was in turmoil. And so we got there in September. And I think the first night we were there, we heard this rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. So I said, Joe, hit the floor. So we crawled over to the window and realized it was the sprinkler.
Oh.
So then we finally got into our apartment. I think we'd been there maybe 5 days. We'd gone up to Isfahan and visited there, and we made it back in time to go to work on Monday. But because there had been graffiti painted on the wall of the embassy, the acting ambassador, the chargé, said, we're going to close the embassy, and I'm going over to the foreign ministry to complain that they're not protecting our embassy, letting people write graffiti and things like this. So the embassy was closed that day. I was waiting at home for the housekeeper to come. I wanted to show her, what I wanted her to do that day, and she never came. So I went on to work, and we just were doing paperwork, administrative things that day.
Knowing that there was already civil unrest dating back to the February before you moved, were there concerns that you had going into that turmoil?
Yes, but there was all sorts of information coming in to the State Department and other agencies that had people, the military and military intelligence, and trying to assess the situation. The people in Washington really believed that they could reset. And so they pulled out all the people who had been at the embassy previous, and they closed all the smaller consulates around. There was one in Tabriz. They closed that. There was one in Isfahan. They closed that. And they thought that sort of a symbol or a message to Iran that we have new people here. There's no prejudice against your new Islamic Republic. And we could still work with the government because it was so important. It was a major oil supplier to us and to Canada, and it was strategically located. They're not far from Russia, and we still had sort of something of a Cold War. And there was still a secular government at that point. The Imam, Khomeini, was not in power yet. It was still people who had been, regular diplomats who had served abroad and understood the rules of diplomacy. That's who the people in Washington were talking with, given assurances, that our embassy would be protected.
And that wasn't necessarily the case. Things happened.
That's right.
Take me through the time of when the embassy kind of got raided and what you had to do and where you went.
That morning, I had gone over to get my diplomatic ID card and turned in my passport. I had to leave that with them to get my Iranian ID card, which meant in the future I couldn't just go to the airport and leave. So I went back to the consulate and told my husband that he should go over and turn his in too, and that the ladies were kind of nervous over there in that office, and they had asked me why I'd come to work that day, and I said, well, I always come to work. And they said, but no, today is the day of the martyrs, and they were nervous. So he didn't listen to me, thank goodness, or he would have been there at the Chancery when a couple of hours later it was overrun by the militant students. So we were there in the consulate. It was called Fort Apache. It had been the state-of-the-art protection with bulletproof glass and all sorts of things, almost. So at about 10 o'clock, we could see that there were all these people on the compound with sticks and clubs and rocks and things. And the numbers just kept growing. And so we closed the door, locked them up, and went up to the upper floor where there were fewer windows and we'd be farther away. And we called the Iranian police and they just hung up on us. So then we thought, well, somebody will be talking to the government and they will come and make the students leave like they did in February. That's what they had done the February previous to that, and they'd all cleared out. The local employees were very nervous and they took off their ID cards and threw them behind the file cabinets so they'd be hard to find. You know, it would take a while before anybody noticed. Because it was the building for visa applicants, we had a back door that was not on the main compound. It was separate. And so we headed out and nobody was there. They'd forgotten about it or they didn't know about it because it was a new building. And there was just the Revolutionary Guard there and they were not in on this embassy sit-in, as the militants were calling it. So we left a few at a time in a group of about six people. And then some of our colleagues left ahead of us and they went one way, they turned left. 6 of us left, the other couple, the Lijeks, another couple who was there, the only other spouse that was there, and her husband, and Bob Anders, who was worked with us in the consular section, and Joe and I. And we started walking toward the British embassy, which was supposed to be our safe haven. But then we saw there was a whole nother mob coming from that direction. Bob said, well, I live close to here, I'm going home. So we said, we're coming with you, Bob. So we split up, and so we'd be less noticeable. And it started to rain, and that was unusual because it hadn't rained the whole, 2 months we were there. So we had the umbrellas. And so we made it to Bob's house. But the other people that had left in front of us, the other Americans, were all picked up within about 5 minutes.
You couldn't have stayed at Bob's house for long. If he's an American, the Iranians, they know what's going on. They know who is who. How did the Canadians get involved?
The first night we were there, the lady over at the Iran American Society, Kathleen Stafford, was on the phone to Washington. Back then, if you were able to get a long distance line out, if you hung up, you might not get it back. So they stayed on the phone to Washington trying to tell them what they could hear on the embassy radios and what they heard from other people, other Americans that were not at the embassy. They were keeping those lines open, and they were also talking to our charge, who was in the foreign ministry. And since this was the secular government, still, they were allowing him to talk on the phone to other embassies. She asked us if she sent her car over, if we would go over and keep the line open while she and her colleague went to sleep for a while around midnight. So we did that until dawn. So then in the morning, she thought she was going to be safe because that Iran American Society had not been attacked in February, and it was away from the embassy, and it was in another part of the city. So she loaned us her car, and we went over to the Lijek's house. They got some clothes. They figured their landlord did not like Americans very much, and so they wanted to get out. So they picked up some clothes, and we raided their refrigerator, and then we went to our house. Our landlord was very kind and asked if they could help and things like that. So we thought we could just wait it out. And we also thought this was going to be over in 24 hours like it had been in February. That evening, we talked to Vic Thompson, who was there over in the foreign ministry. He'd gone with the ambassador to complain about the graffiti. So he said, I have friends at the British embassy. They'll come and get you and you can spend the night over there. So we thought, oh, well, that's good because eventually these militants are going to find the list of housing and they're going to come and look for people. So that night, the British embassy people sent over a driver. They picked us up and went back to Bob Anders' house and picked him up and took us all to the British compound. Well, in the morning, we got another call from Vic saying, you can't stay there because their embassy was raided too, and they're afraid they can't protect you. You'll have to leave. So he said, my Thai cook has keys to 4 different people's houses. And so the Brits will take you over to John Graves' house, who was a hostage by that point, and they'll let you in. You can hide in there. But anyway, we hid there for a few nights. The housekeeper was there, and she was afraid that she was going to get in trouble. We were afraid she was going to turn us in. And so we went to another house, And all this time we're running out of food and money and clothes because we keep putting them in the washing machine and then we leave.
Yeah.
It wasn't funny, but it was kind of absurd. We finally were at Kate Cope's house, and we knew that they were going to find the list. This was open to the road. There was no fence around it like most of the houses had a fence. And the windows were wide open. And so that's when Bob Anders called his friend, who he played tennis with, at the Canadian Embassy and said, "I've got a problem." And John Sheardown, his counterpart at the Canadian Embassy, said, "Fine, why didn't you call sooner? Come on over." And he said, "Well, I've got these 4 other people with me." And he said, "That's fine too, bring them all." We called Vic and he sent the driver back again, and they took us to the Canadians.
80 days. 80 days you were in hiding. That could not have been easy.
Well, compared to what our friends were undergoing at the embassy, it's always relative.
Sure.
And the Canadians were wonderful. And we still thought what would finally happen was there would be negotiations, because this was ridiculous. Countries don't do this. Countries are required to protect the people who are at the embassies in there. So we thought eventually the negotiations would take place. But finally, after all this time, we thought they're not going to be able to just, like we had thought, they would have a passel of European ambassadors escort us to the airport to join the others. Well, after all this time was passing, we thought that's probably not going to work. They'll have to figure some other way to get us out. So then Flora MacDonald, who was basically the Secretary of State for Canada, buttonholed Cyrus Vance, our Secretary of State in Europe, and said, "You've got to get your people out. My people are in danger too." That's when they turned to the CIA. And the CIA was able to put this plan together within 1 month to get us out.
Talk to me about the emotions throughout these 80 days that you had, because I'm sure scared, fear, a lot of different emotions came into play.
Oh, well, one thing is you feel terrible putting the Canadians in danger. They're strangers, they didn't even know us, and here they are doing this for us. That was always in the back of our minds. There was a constant roller coaster of, we're going to negotiate, the hostages are going to get out, they're going to be freed. They're not. There was another negotiator would come or try to come, and they wouldn't even be able to get into the country. And so it was constantly up and down. Thanksgiving came, and then Christmas came. And so by then it was pretty bleak, because by then, it's a whole month, almost 2 months by then. We didn't see any end in sight. So one night, I think it was New Year's Eve, we went over to the Sheardowns' house. We could all be together for once, because usually it was just Joe and I staying with the ambassador, and the other 4 had stayed at the Sheardowns' house. For the New Year's, we thought we should let Pat and Ambassador Taylor have a night to themselves. And so one of the other embassy people who were also helping with this from New Zealand offered to give us a ride home afterwards so the Taylors could go home and have some time to themselves. And so we said, sure, but on the way home, they got lost. And so we were driving around Tehran with all these roadblocks and sandbags with people with rifles and things behind them. And we thought, if we get caught, we don't have any papers. Our ride, these kind friends are going to get in trouble. So I said, I'm never leaving this house again until it's for good. So that was the worst night.
All of this, and then some, is captured in the movie Argo. Ben Affleck directed and starred in the movie several years ago. Obviously, there's some artistic liberty that they put in. How true to form is a lot of that movie, of what you experienced?
Well, I thought he did a really fine job. He shows that the Iranians had a case, since the West had replaced Mossadegh, who was democratically elected. There were all sorts of stories about Sadek and the Iranian Secret Service and, internal police force, so like their FBI. Opposition to the Shah was not allowed. And so there was a lot of resentment, and also that the Shah was ushering in the modern world when the rest of Iran wasn't ready for it yet, especially out in the countryside and more conservative areas. And all this wealth, this enormous wealth from oil, it was so uneven. The Shah's family lived in palaces and had jets and baths and honey and milk and just every extravagance possible when there were people who had nothing to eat and were poor. All of that was boiling and under the surface. So, and they considered us to be supporting him. He was a friend of the West, and so Ben Affleck did a good job of at least showing, that they had reasons to be angry at the Shah and America. And he also did a very good job of showing the loyalty of the household staff. The staff at the ambassador's residence could have turned us in any time, but they were loyal to him. And so that's why, that's just amazing right there. Ambassador Taylor wasn't given a whole lot of credit in the movie because the movie was about Tony. Really, that was the focus. And I can imagine when you're making a movie and you have to say all this in 90 minutes, you have to keep it kind of simple so people don't get lost. So he did a good job on focusing on Tony, who was really quite an amazing hero. But at the end, they put in some footnotes to thank Canada for the cooperation and everything. I would have liked to see them also mention John Sheardown and his wife, because they were equally heroic. And they really never, ever got much credit for what they did.
You finally make your way out of Iran. What was the sense of relief like?
Super duper. When we were on that plane and they said you are now out of Iranian airspace, that was exactly right in the movie. We were so happy, but we couldn't show it. The emotions that he showed in the movie are true, but we didn't know who was on the plane. We couldn't let anybody know. And this was a big secret. We were not going to be telling anybody this story for a long time, even after we got out. In fact, we weren't even planning on letting our families know that we were out, because they couldn't chance it. They couldn't take a chance. They didn't know if the hostages would be punished for our escape. We felt that way as displayed in the movie, but we couldn't show it. But we did have Bloody Marys.
I'm getting goosebumps just hearing that story and the realization of you weren't able to talk to any family or friends for that entire period. What was it like being able to finally embrace another family member once you did get home?
That was wonderful. And my mother really suffered more than I did by a long shot in this, because the State Department also was not set up for dealing with a situation like this. They did not have people trained, officers who understood this classified information of where we were there to talk to family members. When my family would call and say, where are they? Sometimes they would have somebody who knew, who was an officer and had clearance, and they would say, no, they're safe. We can't tell you where they are, but they're safe. And then they would call another time and they would say, oh, they're somewhere out on the street. So my mother was a total wreck. And, we couldn't let them know. I had called them as soon as I got to our apartment. I called home and said, you're going to hear things on the news, but don't worry, I'm fine. And so that's the last they heard from me until I saw them.
Was there ever a point after you got home where you turned to your husband, Joe, and said, look, we're done doing this diplomacy. We're going to stay stateside?
That would have been smart, probably. We thought, well, we've checked that box. That won't happen again. Should be smooth sailing now.
And it was for a while. Take me through just briefly Ivory Coast and Sudan. Were they even in your mind remotely close to what the emotions and what you experienced in Iran were?
Well, the thing about this Ivory Coast was that was a little bit unstable when we arrived. They'd had their coups, but it was supposed to have been all sorted out. So it was supposed to be just fine. The problem in the Ivory Coast was everyday crime. If you went to the store, like the grocery store, you had to jump out of your car and run in, because there were people there, people with guns, who would come up to you and make you get back in the car, and they'd take your money, your jewelry, and your car and leave you someplace, and then go take your car to commit a crime, a robbery or something someplace. And then eventually somebody to find your car something like that. And you could also be chased. If you were on a highway someplace, you could be chased down by somebody and made to pull over. So anyway, there was that sort of thing. When we did have this attempted coup and various leaders were killed and their families were killed, then the embassy was trying to decide if it was over or if it was going to resolve again or what. So it was a question of, is the school going to close? If the school closes, the families have to leave, and sort of trying to figure this all out. So we did have to leave. We did have about a week, though. We were able to make arrangements to have apartments to stay in Washington area and wait until things calmed down. I was evacuated at that point for 9 months. And then when you're in an evacuation status, you don't know from 1 month. They let you know this month, no, you're not going back next month. And then you wait for another 30 days and they say, no, you're not going back. So you just have to sort of live your life that way in a hotel generally.
You touched on the Ivory Coast, hit a little bit on Sudan. Did that differ a lot from the Ivory Coast?
Yes. In Sudan, that was the embassies were directly attacked. The Ivory Coast was factions fighting each other, but in Sudan, first the British and German embassies were attacked, and luckily ours had been, a brand new one had been built farther out of town in another direction, so it wasn't so easy to get to. We lived downtown, but the embassy was farther out and very well built, and it was another sort of fortress type of building, which we have had to build nowadays. So I was at home watching CNN as the people are approaching the embassy, and I'm thinking, I really can't call Joe and ask him how it's going, because he was the chargé trying to, keep everybody calm over there. And so I asked the guards to call their friends and see what was happening. Thank goodness for cell phones. We had about 24 hours there to clear out. Luckily, that embassy was not. I was thinking he must have been having deja vu, because, there were about 300 people that came to attack the embassy, and I think they were bussed in. I don't think they were local Sudanese people. Our guards held the ground, our contract guards. They didn't kill anyone, or I don't think inflict any major injuries on the people who were attacking. They just, it was enough of a threat that nobody got over the wall. They did a lot of damage, but they didn't get in. But we still had to evacuate. And that was the same time that there were 40 different embassies around the world, not embassies, but consulates or missions, U.S. government missions around the world that were attacked. So this was at the same time that Ambassador Stevens was killed in Tripoli. It was that same period. So that's why that was part of all of this upheaval.
Through all of this time, from the time that you moved to Tehran to through the Ivory Coast into Sudan, you were still painting. You were still creating art. Where were you drawing your inspiration from?
It is fascinating to live in Africa. And, you see people getting up in the morning. They have almost nothing. They just have, sometimes you'll see a little market and somebody is selling nothing more than a basket of tomatoes. And they get up every day and they go there and they try to make money to pay, so they have money to pay for their kids. They work long hours. It's grueling. People will work out in a field all day and then they have to go home and grind millet in some big wooden container with a big stick. It just never ends. So you realize how difficult their lives are, but they keep going. All the colors, all of that for a painter, and the shapes of their clothes and everything. I just had a wonderful time painting there. So it's hard not to paint, you just see so much, you want to get it down or react to it or record it.
How would you describe your style, your artistic style?
I think I almost used to be more abstract. I might end up going back to that, but with Africa, it seemed like it gives you an excuse to paint. I want people to see the beauty of watercolor for the medium itself, and then these subjects are just an excuse for me to paint. But then what happens is I start looking at their faces and painting their faces, and they turn into people I know. And so there's just this kind of, process that I hope my appreciation and attachment to these people, gets communicated.
Your artwork can be seen in diplomatic facilities across the world.
Yes.
Obviously, a lot of that is because of everything that you and your husband did. It's got to feel pretty good that people appreciate these paintings and want them in these prestigious buildings.
It is. It's very satisfying. And it's the people in Washington who are constructing the embassies. It's usually not people that know me personally. Well, for example, it was the architects who were building the new embassy in Tunis who said that it would be a good idea to have some of my work in the embassy there. They did know me. But in general, it's the curators for the Arts and Embassy program that I really don't know personally. I think the first time I had my work in Mauritania, I knew the ambassador, and he wanted to put some of my work in his temporary collection, because ambassadors take work with them, and in many of the countries, they can take work with them on a loan basis. So when the curators were planning the new embassy building, they came and saw my work there and said, well, let's see if we can buy some of her work, because it was, in fact, that was a mosque in Mauritania is the one they purchased for that embassy. And it has lots of history, and it's the symbol of Mauritania. I think they like to show that Americans appreciate the beauty of the country, where the embassy is. And so that's also, I'm representing American art, but I'm also representing, America's appreciation for things that we have found in that country.
And you look at your website and you can see some of the places where your art has been purchased and on display. I mean, you're talking about Kuwait, Tunisia, Ivory Coast, Alexandria, even the Smithsonian purchased a piece at one point. I mean, did you ever think when you were at UAB you'd have this kind of reach?
No, I thought I'd be lucky to have some, have the local museum put one of my pieces in their collection. So it's been very satisfying.
That's Kathleen Stafford, a 1973 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences, where she earned her bachelor's degree in art studio. As Kathleen discussed, her lengthy nightmare 45 years ago was turned into a critically acclaimed and award-winning film, Argo, produced and directed by Ben Affleck. With a global perspective, Kathleen has her own idea of what it means to be a blazer.
My experience that the time I was at UAB, people were so compassionate to me. I lost my dad my last semester there. And so they made it possible for me to finish my incompletes in my course. They just were accommodating all the way around. And the same thing with John Dillon, arranging for me to be able to take my printmaking classes in other universities so that I could accomplish what I needed to accomplish. And I just think that kind of sharing and looking out for your community is something I have tried to play forward or pay forward, I guess is the word. And because it meant so much to me. And I have a friend who I went to high school with, and at my 50th high school reunion, I saw him. He is the head of his name is Dr. James Hill. For him to be working on diabetes and probably going to make the difference, his work and his research there is going to make a huge difference for so many people in the world. And I just think I'm so proud that I can say I went to UAB and this is the kind of things they do. It's makes me very proud.
Be sure to check out past episodes of the UAB Green and Told podcast. Listen in at alumni.uab.edu/greenandtold. Have a story to share or know someone who does? Email greenandtold@uab.edu. Finally, be sure to follow us on social media. Just search UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for listening, and until next time, go Blazers.